Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood had always been comforting for Lucy, but tonight the silence was too overwhelming. Her parents had left for a weekend getaway, trusting her to hold down the fort. As a responsible 17-year-old, she relished the independence, but something about the stillness felt off. The wind whistled outside, causing the trees to sway gently. Lucy had just finished her homework and decided to binge-watch some TV. Her favorite spot was the living room couch that faced the large window, which gave a view of the front yard and the empty street beyond. As she scrolled through channels, trying to find something entertaining, she heard what sounded like a soft creak from upstairs. Her body tensed. "It's probably just the house settling," she muttered to herself, shaking off the unease. But that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at her. The street was empty. The porch light flickered slightly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Suddenly her phone vibrated next to her, startling her. A message popped up from her friend, Jenna. "Jenna, you home alone tonight? Wanna hang?" Lucy typed back quickly. "Lucy, yep, but I'm good. Just gonna chill and watch movies." She hit send and decided to brush off the odd noises. Grabbing a blanket, she wrapped herself in it, focusing on the TV again. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the growing sense that something was very wrong. The night wore on, and Lucy began to drift in and out of sleep. The soft glow of the TV was the only light in the room. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the front door jolted her awake. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who could be knocking this late? She glanced at the clock. 11:42 p.m. Too late for visitors. The knock came again, louder this time. Lucy hesitated. Should she answer? She slowly approached the door, peeking through the peephole. Nothing. The front porch was empty. She frowned, double-checking the locks before heading back to the couch. As soon as she sat down, the knock returned, this time more insistent. Lucy's pulse quickened. She cautiously looked through the peephole again, but there was still no one there. Her phone vibrated once more. "Jenna, everything okay?" Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. "Lucy, I think someone's at my door, but no one's there. Jenna, creepy. Want me to come over?" Lucy, "No, it's fine. Probably just kids messing around." But even as she typed the words, she didn't believe them. Lucy tried to relax, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. The knocking had stopped, but a lingering tension hung in the air. She turned the volume up on the TV, hoping to drown out her paranoia. Just as she began to lose herself in the show, something in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Her breath hitched as she glanced toward the window. A shadow. There, standing just beyond the porch, was a tall figure. Its silhouette was barely visible under the dim porch light. Her heart raced. She sat frozen, eyes wide, unable to process what she was seeing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, staring at the house. Lucy's mind raced. Who was this? Why were they just standing there? She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed Jenna's number, her hands shaking. The line rang twice before Jenna picked up. "Hey, what's up?" Jenna's voice sounded casual, unaware of the terror Lucy was experiencing. "There's someone outside my house," Lucy whispered, glancing back at the window. The shadowy figure was still there. "Are you sure?" Jenna asked, her voice now filled with concern. "Maybe it's just your imagination." "No," Lucy insisted. "There's someone there. They're just watching." Jenna was silent for a moment before speaking again. "Do you want me to call the police?" Lucy hesitated. She didn't want to overreact, but the longer the figure stood there, the more certain she became that something was very wrong. "Yeah," Lucy whispered. "Call them." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. Lucy peered through the window, watching as a police car pulled up in front of the house. The figure had disappeared by then, leaving no trace. 2 officers approached the front door, knocking loudly. Lucy quickly unlocked it, letting them in. "Are you okay, miss?" one of the officers asked, scanning the room. Lucy nodded, still shaken. There was someone outside. They were just standing there, staring at the house. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them stepped outside to check the perimeter. The other stayed with Lucy, asking her questions about what she had seen. Could it have been a prank? Maybe some local kids? the officer suggested. Lucy shook her head. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt sinister. The officer didn't seem convinced, but nodded anyway. We'll take a look around and make sure everything's safe. They searched the property thoroughly, but found no signs of anyone. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. After a brief discussion, the officers assured Lucy that it was likely a false alarm, but told her to call them if anything else happened. As they left, Lucy locked the door and double-checked the windows, her nerves still on edge. The figure may have been gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. That night, Lucy struggled to sleep. Every noise made her jump, every shadow made her heart race. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events over and over. At around 2 a.m., she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside her window. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. There, standing just outside, was the figure. Its face was obscured by darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. Just as she was about to call the police, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the front door. Panicked, Lucy jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, her hands fumbling with the locks. Just as she turned the deadbolt, there was a loud bang on the door. The figure was trying to get in. Lucy backed away, her heart racing. She could hear the figure rattling the door handle, pounding on the wood with increasing force. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice shaking. The pounding stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly, the figure walked away, its footsteps fading into the night. The next morning, Lucy called her parents and begged them to come home. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. The police were called again, but once more they found no evidence of anyone being there. Determined to find answers, Lucy began researching the history of the house. What she found chilled her to the bone. Years ago, a man had lived in the house, a recluse with a dark past. He had been suspected of several disappearances in the area, but no evidence had ever been found to link him to the crimes. He had died in the house under mysterious circumstances, and since then, the property had changed hands multiple times, each owner reporting strange occurrences before leaving. Lucy realized that the figure she had seen wasn't just a prankster or a trespasser. It was the spirit of the man who had once lived in the house, still haunting the property, still watching, waiting. She left the house that day and never returned. Tom and Emily had just bought their first house, a beautiful old Victorian home that had been standing for over a century. It was everything they had dreamed of: high ceilings, large windows, and plenty of space. The house had character, with creaky wooden floors and a charming, albeit eerie, atmosphere. The couple spent their first few days settling in, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. Emily had always wanted an older home, and Tom, while more practical, couldn't deny the charm of the place. However, there was one part of the house that gave them both pause: the long, narrow hallway on the second floor. It ran the length of the house, with doors leading to the bedrooms and an attic at the far end. Every time they walked through it, the floorboards groaned loudly, as if the house itself was alive. Emily brushed it off, saying, "Old houses have their quirks." But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something about that hallway felt off. One evening, after spending a long day at work, Tom was alone in the house while Emily visited her sister. He was relaxing on the couch, flipping through TV channels, when he heard a distinct creaking sound coming from upstairs. He froze, listening carefully. The sound persisted, as if someone was walking down the hallway step by step. His heart began to race. The house was empty, or so he thought. Tom tried to ignore the noise, chalking it up to the house settling, but the creaking footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. Finally, Tom couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, he slowly made his way upstairs, his footsteps barely audible over the groaning of the old floorboards. As he reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. The creaking had stopped, but now Tom's eyes were drawn to the attic door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. That was strange. He was sure they had kept it closed. His pulse quickened as he walked toward the door. Every step seemed to amplify the tension in the air. He reached out to push the door open, revealing a dark, dusty staircase leading up into the attic. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from above, like something heavy had fallen. Tom jumped back, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. But there was nothing there, just old boxes and forgotten furniture covered in dust. Tom swallowed hard, his nerves frayed. He quickly closed the attic door and retreated to his bedroom, locking the door behind him. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when Emily returned the next morning, Tom couldn't bring himself to tell her what had happened. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences became more frequent. The creaking footsteps in the hallway became a nightly ritual, and Tom started to notice small objects around the house moving on their own. Keys that had been left on the counter would be found on the floor. Picture frames would tilt slightly, and doors that had been closed would be found ajar. Emily, ever the skeptic, dismissed Tom's concerns. "It's just an old house, Tom. It's bound to make noises." But Tom knew what he had seen, and the unease in his gut was growing stronger by the day. One evening, while Emily was in the shower, Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, staring absent-mindedly at the hallway that led upstairs. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. His eyes drifted to the attic door at the end of the hall, and his blood ran cold. The door was open again. Slowly, Tom stood up, grabbing the flashlight he kept nearby. He made his way toward the attic door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the temperature dropped suddenly, and he could see his breath in the air. The air felt thick, heavy, as though an invisible presence was looming over him. Tom's hand trembled as he pushed the attic door closed, but before he could latch it, a loud bang echoed from inside the attic. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering once more before going out completely. Tom rushed back to the kitchen, his mind racing. He needed to tell Emily what was happening, but would she even believe him? He had tried to ignore it, to rationalize the strange events, but now he was certain. Something was haunting their home. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Tom lay awake, listening for the familiar creaking footsteps in the hallway. But instead of the usual slow, deliberate steps, he heard something different. Whispers, faint, unintelligible voices seemed to echo from the walls, growing louder and louder. Tom's skin crawled as the whispers filled the room surrounding him. He sat up in bed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. But before Tom could catch his breath, the door to their bedroom creaked open slowly, as though someone was pushing it from the other side. He stared in horror as a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway, its outline barely visible in the darkness. It stood there for a moment, watching them before vanishing into thin air. Tom leapt out of bed, waking Emily with a shout. She sat up, groggy and confused. "Tom, what's going on?" He could barely get the words out. "There's something in the house. I saw it." Emily looked at him, her face pale with disbelief. But before she could respond, they both heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps walking down the hallway straight toward their bedroom. In the days that followed, the hauntings became more aggressive. Doors would slam shut on their own. Objects would fly off shelves, and the whispering voices returned, louder and more distinct than before. Tom and Emily began to feel trapped in their own home, their once beautiful house now a prison of terror. Emily could no longer deny what was happening. One night, while they were sitting in the living room, she finally admitted, "Tom, I think we need to leave. This house, it's not safe." Tom nodded, his face grim. "I agree. But what if it follows us? What if this thing isn't just tied to the house?" They both fell silent, the weight of that possibility hanging in the air. The next day, they contacted a paranormal investigator, a woman named Claire who had been recommended to them by a friend. When Claire arrived, she immediately sensed the dark energy in the house. "There's a presence here," she said, walking through the rooms with a sage bundle and chanting softly. "It's not just a ghost, it's something darker." Tom's stomach churned at her words. "Can you help us?" Claire nodded, her expression serious. "I'll do what I can. But this entity, it's powerful. It may not want to leave." The night of the cleansing ritual was tense. Claire set up candles and crystals throughout the house, instructing Tom and Emily to stay close and not to react, no matter what happened. As she began the ritual, the air in the house grew heavy. The temperature dropped and the lights flickered ominously. The creaking footsteps returned, louder than ever before, echoing through the hallway. Suddenly, the attic door flew open with a deafening bang, and the shadowy figure appeared once again at the end of the hall. Claire stood her ground, chanting louder, her voice steady, even as the entity seemed to grow more aggressive. The whispers returned, filling the room with their sinister voices. Tom and Emily clung to each other, watching in horror as the figure approached, its shape shifting and writhing in the dim light. Claire raised her hands, calling out in a language neither Tom nor Emily understood. The shadow stopped in its tracks, as if frozen by her words. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final, ear-piercing screech, the figure dissolved into thin air, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. The ritual was over. Claire turned to them, her face pale but Sarah and Jake had been searching for the perfect home for months, and when they stumbled upon Pinecrest Manor, it seemed too good to be true. Nestled on the outskirts of town, the mansion had a hauntingly beautiful charm with its ivy-covered walls and grand Gothic architecture. The realtor had mentioned that the house had been on the market for years, and the price was shockingly low. Despite its dilapidated state, Sarah fell in love with it immediately, while Jake was more hesitant. "It's a fixer-upper," Sarah had said with a smile, imagining all the ways they could restore the mansion to its former glory. Jake had agreed, albeit reluctantly. The house was massive, with more rooms than they knew what to do with, but it was exactly the kind of project Sarah had always wanted. On the day they moved in, the house felt strangely cold despite the warm summer air. Sarah brushed it off as a quirk of old homes, eager to start making the place their own. They spent hours unpacking and cleaning, but by nightfall, the house still felt unsettlingly empty. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the dark hallways seemed to stretch on forever. That first night, Sarah woke up to a loud bang echoing from downstairs. She nudged Jake, but he was fast asleep. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the house settling. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The days turned into weeks, and while they made progress on the renovations, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Sarah noticed it first. Small things, like doors being left open that they had closed, lights flickering even though the wiring had just been updated, and a constant draft that seemed to flow through the house, no matter how many windows they sealed. Then came the shadows. It started one evening as Sarah was walking down the long hallway on the second floor. She was carrying a box of old linens when she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. A dark figure, standing just at the edge of her vision. She turned quickly, but no one was there. Her heart raced as she stood frozen in place, staring down the empty hallway. "I'm just tired," she whispered to herself. "It's nothing." But as the weeks went on, the shadows became more pronounced. She would catch glimpses of figures standing in doorways or darting across the room, only to disappear when she looked directly at them. Jake never saw them, and when Sarah tried to explain what she was experiencing, he laughed it off. "It's an old house," he said, echoing what she had said when they first moved in. "Old houses make noises and play tricks on you. Don't worry about it." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, while Jake was working late, Sarah decided to take a bath to relax. She filled the old clawfoot tub with hot water, lit a few candles, and tried to unwind. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rustling of the wind outside. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the water soothe her nerves, and then she heard it. A soft whisper. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding. She sat up, listening intently, but the room was silent. She let out a shaky breath and leaned back into the tub. But the moment she closed her eyes again, the whispering returned, louder this time. It sounded like a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Sarah." She gasped, scrambling out of the tub, her body shaking with fear. She grabbed a towel and rushed into the bedroom, her mind racing. She was alone in the house, wasn't she? But that voice had sounded so real. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the towel tightly around her, her skin still damp. She waited, listening for any other sounds. But the house had returned to its eerie silence. The whispers didn't come again that night. But from that moment on, Sarah knew she was being watched. Jake remained skeptical despite Sarah's growing unease. He didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, and no matter how many times Sarah tried to explain what was happening, he always brushed it off. But that changed one night when they were both woken up by a loud crash from the kitchen. Jake groaned and rolled out of bed, assuming a shelf had fallen or a pan had tipped over. But when they went downstairs to investigate, they found the entire kitchen in disarray. Dishes were shattered on the floor, chairs were overturned, and the refrigerator door was wide open. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, surveying the damage. "How did this happen?" Before Sarah could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. They both froze as the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the cold air. And then they heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. "Jake?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the front door. "We need to get out of here." But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the house. They stood there, frozen in fear, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. A dark figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shadowy, with no distinguishable features, but they could feel its presence, heavy and malevolent. Jake pulled harder on the door, but it wouldn't budge. "We need to go," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. But before they could move, the figure began to advance, slowly but surely, its footsteps echoing through the silent house. After that night, the haunting became relentless. The shadows that Sarah had seen were now a constant presence in the house. They would appear in every room, moving through the walls and standing at the foot of their bed at night. The whispering voices followed her wherever she went, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. Sarah became convinced that the entity was trying to drive them out of the house, or worse, harm them. She could feel its anger, its hatred, every time it appeared. And Jake, who had once been so dismissive, was now terrified. He had seen the entity, heard the footsteps, and felt the cold, oppressive presence that filled the house. They called in a priest to bless the house, hoping that it would put an end to the terror. But even after the blessing, the hauntings continued. The shadows grew darker, the voices louder, and the entity more aggressive. One night, while Jake was out running errands, Sarah was sitting in the living room, trying to distract herself with a book. But the moment she heard the familiar creaking of the floorboards upstairs, she knew she wasn't alone. The entity had returned. She stood up, her heart racing, and walked toward the staircase. As she reached the bottom step, she saw it, the dark figure standing at the top of the stairs watching her. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were glowing faintly, a sickly yellow light that sent a chill down her spine. "Leave us alone," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. But the figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching her, as if waiting for something. Desperate for answers, Sarah and Jake contacted a paranormal investigator named Malcolm, who specialized in dealing with malevolent spirits. When he arrived, the house was already filled with an oppressive energy. Malcolm wasted no time setting up his equipment, determined to get to the bottom of the haunting. "There's something here," he said after just a few minutes in the house. "Something dark. It's not just a spirit, it's an entity, something much older and more dangerous." Sarah's blood ran cold at his words. "Can you get rid of it?" Malcolm nodded, but his expression was grim. "I'll try, but it won't be easy." That night, they gathered in the living room. Malcolm prepared for the cleansing ritual. He explained that the entity was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each passing day. "You have to stay calm," he warned them. "No matter what happens, don't show it fear." The ritual began, and almost immediately, the temperature in the room dropped. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a dark mist. The entity appeared at the far end of the room, its form shifting and writhing as it advanced toward them. Malcolm raised his voice, chanting in a language Sarah didn't understand as the entity drew closer. It reached out toward them, its shadowy hand stretching through the air, but Malcolm held his ground, his voice unwavering. Suddenly, the entity let out a deafening screech, its form dissolving into the shadows. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting as the lights stopped flickering. Malcolm lowered his arms, breathing heavily. "It's gone," he said, his voice shaky. "For now." Sarah and Jake exchanged a look, both of them exhausted and terrified. They knew that even though the entity had been banished, the house would never feel like home again. In the days that followed, Sarah and Jake made the difficult decision to leave Pinecrest Manor. The house was still beautiful, still full of potential, but the memories of the haunting were too strong to ignore. They packed up their belongings and moved into a small apartment in the city, far away from the mansion and its dark history. But even after they left, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still watching them. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of her eye, or hear a faint whisper in the middle of the night. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew the truth. Some things, once awakened, can never truly be put to rest. Months after they had left the mansion, Sarah and Jake were adjusting to their new life. They had put the horrors of Pinecrest Manor behind them, or so they thought. One evening, while they were sitting in their new living room, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Pinecrest Manor." Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the email. It was a single sentence written in bold black letters. "You can't escape." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she stared at the screen. She glanced at Jake, who had gone pale. Before either of them could react, the lights in the apartment flickered, and then in the corner of the room they saw it, a shadow, watching them.